Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to our next instalment of OEFC in Exile. We're still in Acts 21, and I've got two readings today. One from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, which is complementary to the passage we're looking at today. So 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 19 to 23. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. And then from Acts chapter 21 and verse 17. When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard this, they praised God. Then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. So do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know that there is no truth in these reports about you, but that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality." The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of the purification would end, and the offering would be made for each of them. Years ago, before there were such things as roofs over the show courts of Wimbledon, I had a pair of tickets for the opening day. On the night before, I looked at the weather forecast. Persistent rain all day. My heart sunk. I'd taken the day off work. Our daughter had got the day off school. And we'd been so looking forward to a day's live tennis. In view of the forecast, was it at all worth making the journey? But I paid good money for the tickets, so I felt obliged to go. So we arrived at the championships with a sense of foreboding. It was likely to be a washout. And sadly, unlike the case of the great storm of 1987, the BBC forecast had got it right, and we barely saw a ball hit all day. I wonder what the Apostle Paul's frame of mind was when he arrived in Jerusalem in verse 17 of chapter 21, thus ending his third and final missionary journey of the Acts of the Apostles. He too had heard the warnings of his friends. He too had listened to the foretelling of the prophet Agabus. The weather in Jerusalem for him would not be fair but rough. The accommodation would not be a comfortable hotel room, but a cold and dark prison cell. In the words of the song, Paul knew there may be trouble ahead. So he would not have been human if he did not at least have some sense of trepidation. But as we saw last week, Paul was convinced Jerusalem was the next port of call in God's schedule for his life. This was his testimony to the Ephesian elders at Miletus. And now, compelled by the Spirit, I am going to Jerusalem, not knowing what will happen to me there. But as it turned out, Paul's first trial in Jerusalem did not come from the Jewish religious leaders, but from within the church itself. The question we're considering this morning is this: was the author of both the letters to the Romans and to the Galatians, already written by this time, guilty of compromising the gospel? Was the champion of justification by faith undermining his core message by following Jewish religious customs? Had Paul allowed himself to become a slave to the law of Moses? Or if the truth of the gospel has been established in the church, is it possible to be conciliatory without compromising that principle? I've got 4 headings to help us answer these questions this morning. And firstly, we see in verse 20 that Christians who were carrying baggage. Then they, that's James and the elders, said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law." The gospel had not just gained a foothold in the Roman Gentile world, which has been the focus of Luke's attention since chapter 13. It had also made significant progress in Jerusalem. We know that already from the early chapters of Acts. Chapter 2, and the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. Chapter 6, so the word of God spread. The number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. Now, getting on for 30 years later, the gospel was still making headway in Jerusalem. Thousands of Jews were receiving Jesus as Saviour. But there was a caveat in the elders' update of the situation in the city of David. These Jewish converts to Christianity were still zealous for the law of Moses. The literal translation is this, that they were all zealots for the law. So quite apart from identifying as Christians, they also still identified as Jews, and as such observed the required feasts, the Sabbath regulations, the ritual vows, and the dietary restrictions. I remember once someone speak about evangelicalism in the Anglican Church, and the speaker drew a subtle distinction between evangelical Anglicans and Anglican evangelicals in the Church of England. The former placed the emphasis on their Anglicanism and the latter on their evangelicalism. The question arises, how was it with these Jews zealous for the law? Were they Christian Jews or Jewish Christians? What was paramount for them, their Christian faith or their Jewish religious culture? Well, the elders didn't make that clear to Paul. What they did make crystal clear to him, though, was that these Christians held their Jewish customs as sacrosanct. They were clinging on to them tenaciously. It's been suggested that they regarded themselves as saved by faith, but they were being kept saved by following the Jewish law. If this was true, then they didn't understand the true nature of grace. That Christian faith is grace from start to finish. We're not only saved by grace, we are also kept by grace. Salvation is of the Lord. It's his work entirely and comes to us through grace. Why was it that these believing Jews were so loath to let go of the law of Moses? Why did they keep such a tight grip on their cultural baggage? Well, we have to say that's part of human nature. Old customs are difficult to let go of. They become ingrained in us. What is familiar to us seems safe. What we are used to, we will become comfortable with. In their pre-Christian days, it would have been impressed upon these Jewish Christians weekly by the Jewish religious leaders in the temple or in the local synagogue how important it was to adhere to the law. It was not only their duty, it was what defined them as Jews. Now that they had come to believe that Jesus was the Messiah the Old Testament had foretold would come, they could not dismiss their Jewish heritage lightly. They could not suddenly unlearn a lifetime of teaching from the scriptures. And besides, Jesus too was a Jew, and he quoted frequently from them. It's not difficult to understand where they were coming from. After all Christians tend to carry their religious and cultural baggage with them. It becomes the lens through which we view the Christian faith. The way we do things in church is the right way. We sing the best hymns. We use the most appropriate songbooks. Our services are the right length of time. Our sermons have the right number of points, 3 generally. I grew up in what was then a traditional Baptist church. The church was proud of its Baptist heritage. But there was a young man in the church who, although a keen Christian, liked to poke fun at what he perceived to be a sense of Baptist elitism. And he would say, with his tongue firmly in his cheek, "Of course you know that Christ was a Baptist, or at least he would have been a member of this church had he ever lived in Romford." So before we are too hard on these Jewish Christians of Acts 21 and criticise them for the religious baggage they carried, in our heart of hearts, we know only too well that we have baggage of our own, prejudices, preferences, and preconceptions. The Christians who were carrying baggage lead us, secondly, to the elders who were facing a dilemma, verses 21 and 22. And speaking of these Jewish Christian zealots for the law, James and the elders tell Paul this: they have been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or to live according to our customs. What shall we do? We have that famous saying attributed variously to Winston Churchill and Mark Twain: a lie can travel halfway around the world before the truth puts its boots on. And the Jewish Christians in the church in Jerusalem had heard a false report about Paul. The rumor was that Paul had been teaching the Jewish believers living in Gentile lands in the Roman Empire to disregard Moses' law, and had even been instructing them not to circumcise their sons. Paul, in effect, was careless of the traditions he once observed as a Pharisee, a Hebrew of the Hebrews. And this alarmed them. It made them suspicious of Paul. What they held dear, Paul, it was alleged, despised. So Paul's arrival in Jerusalem presented the church with a problem. The elders were faced with a dilemma. They had a potential rift on their hands if Paul's visit was not handled deftly. The rumor was not true, of course, but the problem with rumors is that people are quick to believe the bad things they hear about good men and women. How do we know the rumor wasn't true? After all, Paul had had some forceful words for the Gentile Christians in Galatia on the subject of Jewish religious practices. This is what he wrote: "Mark my words, I, Paul, tell you that if you let yourselves be circumcised, Christ will be of no value to you." But here Paul was trying to liberate the Gentile believers from the burden of the law, which added not one jot to their salvation. He wasn't teaching Jewish Christians to cast off their Jewish culture. Paul himself was still sensitive to Jewish scruples. His traveling companion Timothy was from a mixed marriage of a Jewish mother and a Greek father. Timothy hadn't been circumcised. Paul saw to it that he was before he joined him and Silas on the second missionary journey. Furthermore, Luke records Paul entering into a Jewish ritual vow at Cenchreae, symbolized by the shaving off his hair on the homeward leg of the same missionary journey. It may have been true, of course, that Paul's thinking in this regard was beginning to shift. How Jewish did his Christianity have to be? If Jewish customs were largely irrelevant for Gentile Christians to pursue, how relevant were they still for Jewish Christians? What he taught the Gentile Christians of Galatia was just as true of the Jewish Christians. By the works of the law, no one will be justified. But nowhere does Luke record Paul had begun to teach the Jewish Christians in the churches outside of the historic borders of Israel that they should jettison their Jewish religious observance. James and the elders were in a quandary, therefore. They praised God for his work of grace among the Gentiles through Paul's ministry. In fact, before their very eyes, they had some visual aids of God's work of salvation. Paul's travelling companions, Sopater, Aristarchus, Secundus, Gaius, Titius, Timothy and Trophimus were all converts from Gentile lands. However, the Jewish members of the church were inclined to believe this falsehood. Paul had been teaching the Jews of the diaspora their Jewish religious culture was of no value to them. Hence, the elders express their dilemma in verse 22. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. It was as if Paul were an acutely embarrassing family relative that the hosts of a family gathering were trying to conceal from the other family members. So, anticipating trouble, the elders urged Paul to join in the purification rites of 4 men in the church. If he would make this public gesture, then everyone would know there is no truth to the rumour. Paul really did respect the law of Moses. He hadn't been telling any Jewish Christians to throw overboard their ancestral customs. He, in fact, observed them himself. We have to be honest here. What the elders were suggesting was tokenism. They were asking Paul to do something not for his own benefit, but to allay Jewish sensibilities. You could make the argument that the elders were wrong to put Paul under this obligation. They should have taken a firm stance with the Jewish Christians zealous for the law. They should have vouched for Paul's integrity and left it at that. But they felt the pressure from their overwhelmingly Jewish church membership all too keenly. Thus, they felt they had no other option than to ask Paul to underline his Jewish credentials by participating in this purification ceremony. Christians who were carrying baggage, the elders who were facing a dilemma, and thirdly, we see in verse 25, the principle that must not be violated. But then the elders make this reiteration. As for the for the Gentile believers, we have written to them our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality. This is a reference to the decision made at the Council of Jerusalem after Paul's first missionary journey had ended, some 10 to 12 years earlier. There it had been decided that Gentile Christians should not be obligated to adopt Jewish customs, other than to observe just a few dietary laws and to avoid, like the plague, sexual immorality. Paul and Barnabas took this statement back with them to the church at Antioch in the form of a letter from the apostles and elders of the church in Jerusalem. Paul, no doubt, passed this message on to the churches during his second missionary journey. So a principle had been established. Gentiles converted to the Christian faith need not be circumcised. They did not first need to become Jews before they became Christians. They did not need to take up Jewish religious practices. Paul and Barnabas in Antioch were at one with Peter and James in Jerusalem. Although James and the elders in the church in Jerusalem were now asking Paul to make a gesture to the Jewish Christians that he was a bona fide Jew, they were in fact still restating this principle of Gentile liberty. This principle was unaffected. It was inviolable. The Gentiles were justified through faith and should not be burdened with Jewish religious practices which added nothing to their salvation. Christians who were carrying their baggage, the elders who were facing a dilemma, and the principle that must not be violated enabled Paul to demonstrate, lastly, that he was the apostle who had the grace to be conciliatory. Look at verse 26. The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Paul submitted to what James and the elders asked of him. Back in July, we considered the conclusion that the Council of Jerusalem came to in regard to Gentile Christians and the Jewish faith. The position taken wasn't actually an expression of the famous saying, in essentials, unity, in non-essentials, liberty, in all things, charity. In other words, the church should unite around the fundamentals of the gospel. However, Christians should allow one another the freedom to differ on secondary issues. And underlying everything, there should be loving acceptance of one another as brothers and sisters in Christ. When Paul complied with the elders' request that he should make this gesture to reassure the Jewish believers zealous for the law in Jerusalem, he was embodying this adage. Paul and James were united in the essentials. Justification was by grace through faith, not through works or through the observance of the law of Moses. As long as the Jews who were zealous for the law accepted this principle, Paul accepted that they had the liberty to still practice the non-essentials of their Jewish religious heritage, while insisting the Gentiles also had the liberty to disregard them. And Paul, out of love for his fellow Jews in the church at Jerusalem, went through with this purification ceremony to demonstrate his solidarity with them. In essentials, unity; in non-essentials, liberty; in all things, charity. A number of really insightful Bible commentators, I have to say, believe Paul made a mistake in complying with the elders' request. They say he compromised the gospel. They maintain he contradicted it. They make the legitimate point that the purification rite he engaged in involved animal sacrifice for sin. Surely engaging in such a ceremony undermined the completed work of Christ on the cross. Jesus' final words on the cross were, "It is finished." No other sacrifice for sin needed to be made. But here was Paul, complicit in the shedding of the blood of animals which served no purpose. The atoning sacrifice had already been made by Jesus. Other commentators don't go as far as saying Paul was wrong, but prefer to reserve judgment. Rather than condemning him for compromise, they conclude his actions were at best questionable. What he did was expedient, but whether it was right or wrong, they cannot be sure. Personally, however, I don't believe Paul was guilty of compromise. He did not concede any ground on doctrinal or moral principle, but he offered a concession to those Jews zealous for the law in religious practice. They put a lot of store by their Jewishness, and Paul understood that. Rather than criticize them for it, he would be conciliatory and identify himself with them and go through with this purification ritual. Paul was being entirely consistent with what he had taught the Corinthians. Though I am free and belong to no man, I make myself a slave to everyone to win as many as possible. To the Jews, I became like a Jew to win the Jews. Paul's heart for the lost was such that he put aside personal preferences, likes and dislikes for the sake of those he was trying to seek out for Christ. When he was with the Jews, he became as a Jew. When he was with the Gentiles, he became as a Gentile. He did this to reach out to people at their own level. In a verse or two later, in the same passage, he writes, "I have become all things to all men, so that by all possible means I might save some." So in my view, Paul was being true to his all things to all men strategy. He tried as far as he possibly could to accommodate the Jew, the Gentile, and the weak without compromising the gospel. He wanted to make the gospel of grace as accessible to them as he possibly could without diluting it. When people use the expression today, "he's all things to all men," it's a criticism. It's said of someone without convictions. He or she simply speaks or behaves in such a way as to please everyone they come across. They're people pleasers, superficial, not men and women of substance or convictions. But that wasn't Paul. By being all things to all men, he sought to relate to a variety of people so that they could first understand the gospel and then receive it. One commentator has made this statement on Paul's compliance. There is a time when compromise is a sign not of weakness, but of strength. But I would take issue with the word compromise. He didn't compromise on truth. He made a concession on religious practice out of generosity of spirit. He had the grace to be conciliatory. How can we apply this first incident of Paul's last visit to Jerusalem recorded in Acts to ourselves? Well, firstly, let's note Paul's grace. He didn't petulantly swat away the elders' request with the infamous words, "Don't you know who I am?" He might have felt himself entitled to protest. "Don't you know the sacrifices I've made? Don't you know the suffering I've been through? Don't you know the signs and wonders that God has worked through me? Don't you know how I've slogged myself in Ephesus, teaching the word of God solidly for 2 years? Don't you know how I have supported myself and never took a penny for my ministry? Don't you know how I've been slandered for the gospel's sake? Don't you know how I was stoned at Lystra and left for dead? And now you ask me to take part in a charade to justify myself to these weaker brothers and sisters who should know better. Do you hear me? I simply won't do it." Had Paul reacted like this, it would have been understandable. It would be like asking Lewis Hamilton to brush up on his driving skills. Instead, Paul is gracious. Paul displays his humility. He shows he is poor and not proud in spirit, and he agrees to the elders' proposal. I doubt that would have been your or my reaction. If we've been treated unfairly or have been publicly maligned, we rush immediately to our own defence. We seek to justify ourselves. We don't back down, we stand up for our reputations. How dare anyone speak ill of me like that? How dare you treat me like that? But Paul made nothing of all his accomplishments as a missionary pioneer and yielded to what was in the best interests of the church in Jerusalem. Because Paul loved people, he put the preferences of the Jewish Christians zealous for the law before his own. He yearned for solidarity between the Jewish and Gentile churches. If this token act on his part could contribute toward it, so be it. So let's note Paul's graciousness when we are slighted, when we are misrepresented, when we are overruled, and when we don't get our own way. Secondly, imitate Paul's strategy. Let's adopt Paul's all things to all men's mindset. One commentator puts it so well. Paul wanted to cross barriers, not put them up. He wanted to speak the language of those he was seeking to reach for Christ. He didn't want how he conducted himself to be any sort of impediment in that outreach. He loved people enough to accommodate them without compromising the gospel. Hence, he was willing to give way in matters of secondary importance. The question we have to constantly be asking ourselves is this: are there unnecessary cultural barriers in the way we do church that make church life inaccessible to the outsider? Are there changes we could make without undermining the fundamental gospel to make the prospect of church seem less alien to the unchurched? Are there subtle changes we could carry through that perhaps aren't necessarily convenient for us, but might be convenient to the inquirer? I know of one church, because it had a burden for families and children on the fringes of the church, that pushed back the time of the morning service to the afternoon. Why? Well, junior football and sport was so prevalent among these families. It prevented them from getting to church in the morning, whereas they could get to an afternoon service. Of course, the church leaders could have taken the view, well, church has priority over football. And of course, they'd be right. But adopting the all things to all men mindset, they knew that they could change the church service from 10:30 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon without compromising the gospel. I'm not saying this type of change will be necessary at Oxford, but the point is this: are we willing to sacrifice our own preferences for the sake of the gospel and the unreached? So the last visit of Paul to Jerusalem in Acts got off to a surprising beginning. The trial came not from outside of the church, but from within it. There were Christians who were carrying baggage, elders who were facing a dilemma. There was a principle that must not be violated, and finally an apostle who had the grace to be conciliatory. By complying with the elders' request, I believe Paul was making a concession to the sensitivity of others rather than compromising the veracity of the gospel. And his stance boiled down to this: in essentials, there should be no compromise. In non-essentials, there could be flexibility. Underlying all he stood for, there had to be first charity and not censure. May we, like Paul, have that same courage to be gracious. Amen.